Oh, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Ashley Hall, and I am the Trees Atlanta Education Intern. So I'm going to share a brief PowerPoint with you guys. Push it back to the beginning here. Oh, no. All right. So today we are going to be talking about incorporating native species as companion plants in your vegetable garden. So we're excited to have you guys join us. And if you would like to view this presentation afterwards, we are recording it and it will be available for you guys in the next few days. We'll email you out that link. So in case you're new to Trees Atlanta's mission is to protect and improve Atlanta's urban forest by planting, conservation, and education. So today we have Sam Cartin, who is a Trees Atlanta employee. He works with us, and he is a BeltLine Arboretum assistant coordinator. He's going to tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. So today, if you guys look on your Zoom, you should be able to see at the bottom or the top of your screen a Q&A button. If you guys could use that to submit questions throughout the presentation, that would be awesome. If it's a more specific question, we might try and bring it in during the slide that he's talking about. If it's more of general, we'll probably wait and answer it at the end. So if you could just use that. I'll also be monitoring the chat. So if you put questions into the chat, I'll be able to see those and grab those for the end as well. So we also want to know how we can serve you guys better. So after this presentation, you will be getting an email that has a survey link in it. So we would love for you guys to fill that survey out. Let us know how we did and how we can improve to give you the best experience possible. Last but not least for me, these are our social medias. We would love for you guys to connect with us on these different things. And for other events like this, we're doing a lot of virtual events and workshops right now. Just go to treesatlanta.org, and if you hit the calendar button, you should be able to see all of the upcoming volunteer opportunities as well as education opportunities. So with that all being said, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Sam.
All right, let me pull up my slide presentation. Get back to the beginning. All right, I'd just like to take this moment to thank Ashley so much for helping me out, and to thank Trees Atlanta as an organization for providing this opportunity for me. And last but not least, I'd like to thank everybody watching this. I'm very passionate about this subject, and it really makes me happy that I have the opportunity to share what I've learned. As Ashley mentioned, I am the assistant arboretum coordinator on the West Side Beltline. So if you've had the privilege of coming out to the West Side Beltline and you've seen all of our flowers and our native landscape restoration, I'm part of that, and I'm very proud to be so. I do not have an academic background in botany. I have an agricultural background. I've gotten my permaculture design certification a few years back. I have a few years working at a gardening company called Farmer D's, if you're familiar. Learned a lot there. And of course, with my past few years experience with Trees Atlanta, I have learned a lot. But once again, I do not have a academic background. So if I do say something that is blatantly wrong, feel free to point it out in the chat. I will not get my feelings hurt, I promise. So the title of my presentation is Native Plants as Garden Companions. We're going to learn about incorporating native species into your vegetable garden and backyard orchard design. So I'm going to start out this presentation kind of giving an overview of what native species restoration is, why it's important to us, why we work hard with invasive removal. Then I'm going to talk about kind of what I weigh in when I'm deciding what plant I'm going to use as a companion. Then at the end of my presentation, we're going to have a top 10 list, in no particular order, my 10 favorite herbaceous plants that I use as companions endemic to the Piedmont region. And as Ashley mentioned, at the end of everything, we'll have a Q&A. I know I mentioned it in the chat. Feel free to type any questions you might have in the chat function, and we'll get to it at the end. All right, so without further ado, let's dive right in. Why is native species restoration important? So if anybody's spent more than 5 seconds in Atlanta, this picture will be familiar to you. This is kudzu. Guaria montana is the Latin name. And it's really become the poster child of what an invasive species is, why an invasive species has gone wrong, and just how the more negative end of invasive species, they just monoculture everything, they really take over. So kudzu was used by the Department of Transportation as erosion control back maybe half a century ago, because people notice it grows very rapidly, it controls erosion, we can plant this, we can utilize it, but it really just took over. And back before I really learned about ecology, I kind of thought kudzu was really cool. I mean, it does look really cool. It's this lush green growth. And I had the idea that from an ecological perspective, the biggest problem we had was global warming, was we don't have enough photosynthesis going on. We need more plant growth. And I had the misconception that, well, if this plant really is growing so aggressively, that can't really be a bad thing, right? That makes sense? Wrong. It doesn't make sense. It's very oversimplified. And the reason why that is because native plant species bolster insect populations. Invasive plant species do not. So here on the left side, I have a chart that I borrowed from a Doug Tallamy lecture, a guide to restoring the little things around the world. Doug Tallamy is really the man in native restoration. I'll dive a little more into him later. But this lecture is available on YouTube if anyone wants to look into it. This graph is a study where participants collected the biomass of insect life in a native hedge and an invaded hedge. So a hedge with invasive species. A good example of that is going to be the bottom right picture. Ligustrum sinensis, anyone who's volunteered with Trees Atlanta, chances are you pulled a good bit of this Chinese privet, just really like the prime example of an invasive hedge species. And then up top, to contrast, I have two native hedge species, Itea virginica and then Calocarpa americana. That Calocarpa americana is American beautyberry. Itea virginica, common name would be Virginia sweetspire. These are both native shrubs, really great for pollinators. And as you can see with the graph, a reduction of 96% in biomass. Insects are found on native species. They are not found as much on invasive species. So when I talk about the need to bolster insect populations to help the bees, help the wasps, help all these insects, a lot of people might immediately have a reaction like, no, I don't care about that. I don't want these insects in my yard. I spray for the mosquitoes. I don't want these little critters in my yard because they're gross. And I really think it's important to highlight why that is very, very short-sighted. So I think it's an objective fact. The displacement of native plant species is a precipitating factor to ongoing ecological collapse, and the failure to incorporate insect life is a big part of that. So here's 3 articles that I linked that I think are very good reads that are adjacent to this subject. Here's an article from The Guardian. Insect apocalypse poses risk to all life on Earth, conservationists warn. Very, very dire. Report claims 400,000 insect species face extinction amid heavy use of pesticides. Now, while that article might focus on the use of pesticides and how they might directly have toxic impact on insects, I would argue that the use of pesticides is directly linked to invasive species, especially when you look at it through the lens of conventional landscaping. Because of course, if you follow the habits of your conventional landscaping company, they're going to be spraying a good bit of pesticides on the lawn, in and around the shrubs. And I would say that those 2 factors are linked. Here's a Deutsche Welle article on the top right, why biodiversity loss hurts humans as much as climate change. This really kind of gets to that misconception I had about, we need invasive species because they can fight climate change. This article does a really good job of highlighting how biodiversity loss is the key ecological crisis that we're facing, and not just the temperature. Of course, those 2 are linked, but it's not as if the global temperature rises 5 degrees, it's going to be too hot for humans. It's not that. It's that the disruption in the patterns is going to wreck ecological balance. So the subtitle of that article, a UN-backed report says 1 million species are at risk of extinction, and warns biodiversity loss and failure to conserve ecosystems has catastrophic effect on people as well as nature. So of course, there are so many factors involved in that, but I would definitely argue that the loss of native species habitat and the increase of invasive species is very clearly tied to that. NPR, down at the bottom, North America has lost 3 billion birds, scientists say. And of course, when you think about what birds use to feed their young, you can't deny that the loss of insect biomass is directly tied to the loss of bird population. All right, that's enough doom and gloom. Let's move on. So why is that? Why is it that insects are so reliant on native species? The big reason why that is native species support higher rates of specialized pollinators and specialized larval hosts. So let's start at the picture on the bottom left. We have a Agraulis vanilli, a little larva that is a Gulf fritillary butterfly, and he is munching away at a Passiflora incarnata, a passion vine. This is one of my favorite pollinator hosts plants in Georgia. Every time I've ever seen one in the summertime, I almost always see the caterpillar on it. And this is a really prime example that kind of like conflates with a misconception I had. I read one of my favorite books as a child was The Very Hungry Caterpillar. It is a very, beautifully illustrated book about a caterpillar that he eats donuts, he eats tomatoes, he eats all these things. And at the end, he turns into a butterfly. Wonderful book. Read it to your children. Very, very misleading because the reason why most caterpillars, not all, but most larval forms of your butterflies and moths, they're specialists. They don't just eat any plant. They eat one or two species or just a very select genera. They can't just eat anything. The reason why that is because these species have evolved alongside these plants for millennia. They can't just all of a sudden jump over and just eat the kudzu that's growing where their passion vine used to. That same principle applies to pollinators to a degree. A lot of people will see honeybees, bumblebees, and butterflies pollinating anything. But the reality is a big number specifically of native bees, they're specialist pollinators, sort of in the same concept that the larval form of butterflies might be specialist larvae. A lot of native species are dependent on particular native flowers. And this picture up at the top right is a picture of a hairy sunflower that is in the Helianthus genus. And I chose that because the Helianthus genus is very important to providing that pollen, and of which native bees are very, very reliant on. This picture in the bottom right, that is a mama cardinal feeding a caterpillar to her babies. And this just really highlights the reason why, just the link between the insect life and higher orders of animal life. You can't just turn a blind eye and pretend that this massive reduction in insect population isn't going to have a cascading effect throughout other aspects of biology. All right, planting native bolsters biodiversity. Very straightforward. The bottom left, this is a picture of goldenrod in bloom in the late summer. I took this picture on the west side BeltLine, kind of near Besson Brewing and Golders Kombucha. Really great example of how, a general rule, native plants are going to have better pollen output, better nectar for pollinators. If you look closely, obviously right away you see the very charismatic monarch butterfly. You see some bumblebee species, a few honeybees, a few other native bees. You can see, you look at my mouse, a big old bumblebee butt in mid-flight. Really a great pleasure to just be up and close and personal with goldenrod as it's blooming in the late summer and early fall. On this picture on the right, that is another picture I took on the west side BeltLine that I thought really encapsulates just the benefit of native landscaping and how you can do it and make it look good. So here in the background, we have a Circus canadensis that is a redbud tree. He's already bloomed for the season, but of course, everyone who knows redbuds, bees go crazy for them in the early spring. Down here at the bottom, I apologize, I should have labeled these, but if anyone has any questions, I can put it in the chat function. We have the Itea virginica, the sweet spire that I was telling you about. If you look at those white column blooms. The yellow blooms, those are going to be lance leaf coreopsis, and the red and yellow blooms, that is going to be Gaillardia pulchella, Indian blanket flower. And I just chose this picture once again because it highlights how all of these species can work together side by side, whereas this area was kudzu maybe 10, 15 years ago. It was really dominated by one species. And here you have a dozen or so species really working together. And it highlights how these native species that have evolved, co-evolved over millennia, they work together more often than being very domineering and creating a monoculture. All right, if anybody would like to look into additional resources to landscaping, native landscaping that is, I mentioned Doug Tallamy earlier. These two books in the bottom left, Nature's Best Hope, Bringing Nature Home, just really like excellent books for anybody looking into the subject. Doug Tallamy, if you were a podcast person, just type his name into any podcast search feature. You'll have plenty of options to choose. I would recommend the In Defense of Plants podcast as a really good interview with Doug Tallamy, where he just sums up everything very well. And once again, Doug Tallamy is the professor of entomology and ecology at the University of Delaware. Just the guy of native landscaping. Another resource, another workshop that Trees Atlanta did that is available recorded on the Trees Atlanta website from Lawns to Native over here on the right is a virtual workshop with Scott Braslow, who was one of our all-star volunteers. A really cool video. He just kind of gives the audience a tour of his backyard, how he started out. It's not a crazy big backyard, but when he moved into his house, it was kind of, you know, your conventional landscaping plants where they might be low maintenance, they might, you know, look good for seasons, but they don't really provide that habitat and for insects. And I'd definitely recommend this workshop for anyone specifically in the Atlanta area who wants to learn about what plants might work well, what plants might work well in shade, and I just highly recommend it. All right, so now I'm going to kind of get into the meat of what I want to talk today about. I'd say the thesis of my presentation was this: when assessing what species to incorporate into a holistic garden design, selecting a diversity of native species as companion plants in and around your fruit and vegetable production is an effective way to build soil health, attract beneficial wildlife, and mitigate pest and disease. So this picture in the background, this is a picture I took at the HeartNet Community Garden, affiliated through WAWA, West Atlanta Watershed Alliance, a great nonprofit. And this is one bed out of, I want to say about 12 they have in their garden that I really just dedicated to native native companion plants. And this kind of highlights how when I think of companion plant, I'm not just thinking of, okay, I'm going to grow my basil right underneath my tomato. I'm thinking of this as me cultivating ecology in my backyard to draw in beneficial insects, to create biomass, to build the soil, and to just, you know, create a little mini ecosystem in my backyard, so I'm not having a sterile environment where I might have to deal with my pests or problems individually. I'm trying to think of it more holistically. So I have a little anecdote from my time as a professional gardener. As you might have guessed, if you have the money to just hire somebody to come and do your gardening in your backyard, you probably have a good bit of money. My clients were generally in wealthier neighborhoods. I would go to their backyard, these sprawling palatial estates with more often than not very, very expensive landscapes, you know, full of many exotic species, very well manicured lawns, sprayed, treated. And when I would get to their gardens in the back of their property, a lot of these people, I just noticed they had higher incidence of like aphid infestation and disease. And I never really saw as many beneficial insects, your predatory wasps, your ladybugs, or pollinators in general. I never really saw them quite as much. And I would stop and think about this. Well, I mean, if everything in your 3 acres of land is inedible except for the food you're growing for yourself, then the aphids are going to focus on that area. And of course, this is only anecdotal evidence. I'm not going to publish any peer-reviewed studies with this, but it really highlighted the concept that if you want to control pests and disease in your plants and your vegetables or your fruit trees, you should create a more balanced ecosystem in your entire landscape. The best way to do that is with native plants. Excuse me. So I'd like to highlight what's going on in this picture. This big, stunning crimson flower in the background, this is Monarda didyma. Scarlet bee balm is a common name for it. Really just an awesome flower. I'll delving into each of these flowers later, but I just wanted to give you all a primer. Hummingbirds go crazy for this guy. Aesclepias tuberosa, this is going to be a butterfly weed, one of the all-stars of the Aesclepias genus. The host plant, the larval host plant for the monarch butterfly, so a very important plant to be planting right now. Echinacea purpurea right here down at the bottom left. And actually it's a nativar. I'll be going into that later. It is a cultivar of a native species, which I'm not, too keen on that, but I'll definitely be explaining that later. Achillea millefolium down here at the bottom right, that is a yarrow. And as you can see, all these plants work together very well. There's actually some comfrey that you can't see at the bottom left, but that's another workshop. But point being, all of these species work very well together, planted pretty close in a 4x4 box. So it really just kind of goes to show you don't have to space these out too much. And if I wanted, I could throw a tomato in here. It would thrive. I mean, any vegetable with each of these species are pretty spatially compatible, but that is a factor that we will talk about next. Multifunctionality. This is really the key concept of how I weigh and balance the functions of what I'm going to be selecting as a companion. So apart from yield and visual appeal, when analyzing what species to include as a companion in a holistic garden design, I focus on these three main factors: positive impact on soil health, beneficial wildlife attraction, and spatial compatibility. So over here to the right, I have that Monarda didyma again, scarlet bee balm. I chose this plant for this slide because it really highlights a plant that is very multifunctional. So I have the yield from it. I could harvest the flowers or the leaves to make a tea. It's a very, very diverse plant, and herbalism makes a very aromatic tea. People could use it as a garnish. I know some people that use it in cocktails. Visual appeal is, speaks for itself. This was the first bloom of the season when I took this picture. And this, I should explain, this picture I took at the garden center that I used to work at. When this Monarda was in bloom, we would always have people coming in like, I want that red flower. What's that red flower? I want it right now. So we would sell it Monarda fasciculosa, kind of the less impressive cousin, sort of, maybe not the most honest thing, but we didn't have Monarda didyma at the time. But just mainly to speak of how visually striking this plant is. As far as positive impact on soil health, Monarda didyma is a relatively deep-rooted perennial. Perennial species are almost always preferential to annual species in terms of building soil health. And that is the reason why is because the root masses are going to reach much deeper into the soil. As the plant diebacks, that biomass will feed soil biology. Beneficial wildlife attraction. I think I may have mentioned earlier, this plant is just, every time I've seen this plant in bloom, I've seen a hummingbird around it. It is a great beneficial wildlife attractor. In terms of spatial compatibility, it's maybe not the best plant to highlight that concept, but this plant will spread. I wouldn't necessarily plant this right next to your tomatoes, but I would definitely have this plant in your backyard and your ecosystem for the previous mentioned reasons. So I'm going to break down each of those concepts, a very surface level explanation for all of these. So when it comes to positive impact on soil health, the two main concepts that I like to keep in mind are nitrogen fixation and dynamic accumulation. So nitrogen fixation, I chose Chamaecrista fasciculata which is known as Partridge Pea is a common name. A really good example of this. Nitrogen fixation is the process by which plants fix nitrogen into the soil from the atmosphere through a symbiosis with subterranean bacteria known as rhizobia. So most nitrogen fixers are in the legume family, Fabaceae, I believe. My Latin is correct. But not all nitrogen fixers are Fabaceae. There are a few other native nitrogen fixers. Wax myrtle is a great example. But right now I'm going to highlight Partridge Pea because it is just a champion nitrogen fixer. Really great biomass and really great for other reasons, which I'll delve into later. But it's important to have nitrogen fixers in your ecosystem, in your design, specifically for the reason that nitrogen is a little debated, but I mean, it's the number one element in terms of fertilization. It is the green element that makes photosynthesis possible. So I would definitely have this plant, Partridge Pea, adjacent to, say, a fruit tree that you might want to have a little extra nitrogen in there. And moving on, dynamic accumulation. I chose Yarrow for this concept. So what I mean by dynamic accumulation is the process by which a plant will accumulate minerals and organic material in the topsoil by mining it from the subsoil with its deep roots. So of course, perennials are going to be preferred for this concept. And I chose Yarrow, even though it's not really the biggest, most intense accumulator of these nutrients. I chose it because for how deep and extensive its root mass will be, it's actually a pretty short growing plant. So an excellent plant to get some dynamic accumulation going around some of your, prize crops, your vegetables, your fruit trees. And once again, a very, very shallow explanation for each of these concepts. If you have any more questions, definitely type them in the chat. Attracting beneficial insects, the other important function. I would probably argue the most important function and what native plants do better than anything else. For dynamic accumulation, it's a mouthful, and nitrogen fixation, there are plenty of non-native species to choose for both of those. But when it comes to attracting beneficial insects, I think when you take into consideration the extended capacity for native species to attract specialized pollinators and specialized larval hosts, I think that native species attract beneficial insects more effectively than anything else. And I just kind of like to bounce back to the concept of how it's a little frustrating as someone who works in the ecological field when I talk about, oh, well, we need to bring back habitat for pollinators, for these beneficial insects, your bees, even your wasps down here. A lot of people are like, oh, I don't want those in my garden. You do, you really do. If you're trying to grow tomatoes, you're trying to grow vegetables, fruit trees, you want these stinging insects in your garden. Just be nice. Don't swat at them. They're friendly. They smell your fear. Just be very pleasant. They won't hurt you. And I chose Sphex ignominius. My Latin is questionable again, but I chose this golden digger wasp who's pollinating Aesclepias tuberosa, the butterfly weed, just really to highlight how here is a wasp that doesn't sting, that is pollinating, that is actually really great to have around your garden, because this guy parasitizes the tornado hornworm, just the scourge of any tomato gardener, and amongst any number of other pests. You want these beneficial insects around your garden. You just do. And the best way to do that is to plant flowers and plant native species. Monarda fistulosa is being pollinated by an eastern tiger butterfly. Just really to highlight how having more pollinators in and around your garden will increase your fruiting production. If you've noticed when you're growing tomatoes and the tomato kind of falls off without forming the flower falls off without forming a fruit, a decent chance of why that is could be maybe it wasn't pollinated effectively. And the best way to avoid that is to just increase your pollinators. Now down here at the bottom right, I have a picture I took. You can tell it's a picture I took because it's a little blurry. Rudbeckia hirta, a black-eyed Susan. If you look closely, you can see a ladybug who is just going to town on some aphids. And this kind of highlights the concept of a trap crop. So I would plant some black-eyed Susans to attract aphids, which might be a little counterintuitive. I've had some people like, why do you want to attract aphids to your garden? If you look closer, these black aphids, they're specialized towards the Rudbeckia genus. They aren't going to hurt your tomatoes. They aren't going to hurt your kale. But by drawing them in, that's how you get the ladybugs. That's how you get the other beneficial insects in there. You attract what they eat. At the garden center I used to work at, we would sell, like, it was kind of sad. We would sell like these refrigerated ladybugs in a box. And I'm not saying don't do that. Of course, it can definitely, spark some ladybug populations in your garden. But I really think if you want to do that effectively, just work from the ground up, attract what these ladybugs are going to eat, and they'll come. You plant it, they'll come. Spatial compatibility is the last concept, and it's really self-explanatory. I chose Agastache foeniculum on the left, Anise Hyssop, a great native species member of the mint family. I'll explain a little more later. I took this picture at the Hartnett Community Garden that I mentioned earlier. You can't necessarily see, but this is right at the base of the tomato plant, black cherry tomato that really just exploded last year. And I chose that to highlight a native species plant that is really spatially compatible. You can put this plant right next to what you're growing, and it'll give you that benefit without kind of strangling what you're planting, your tomatoes, your peppers, what have you. And Agastache foeniculum, and it's just, if it does kind of get too big and start climbing over everything, harvest some of it. Its leaves are very aromatic. You use them in the same sense that you would use bee balm. You can make a tea out of it, cocktails, garnish in a salad, chop it up finely, as a very pleasant licorice flavor. Now, on the other end of that spectrum, Passiflora incarnata, passion vine. This is a plant that I love, that I would definitely incorporate into my garden design, but I would have it, keep them separate. Keep them at the end of your garden, maybe on your back fence line. Because if you plant this guy next to your tomato, it's going to take over. They're going to climb all over each other. I chose Passiflora incarnata as a plant that is not spatially compatible. And it's really just common sense. Like, you don't want to plant a vine next to a vine. You want to plant a plant that might be growing short next to your prize-winning vegetables. All right, moving on. This last little bit, I'm going to explain my 10 favorite garden companions endemic to the Piedmont region. Endemic is just a fancy word for native. In no particular order, so I don't want to like overthink this. Or if anybody gets their feelings hurt, like, oh, I really like Echinacea more than this. In no particular order. So I started with Chamaecrista fasciculata, Partridge Pea, a great native plant. Not too picky about sun, but of course it works best in a prairie environment. Incredible beneficial insect attractor, a great nitrogen fixer, pumps out loads of biomass, great habitat for overwintering insects. And I chose this picture on the right. This is an up close example of an extra floral nectary, or EFN. This is a kind of a little outlet for nectar that isn't at the flower, that attracts all sorts of beneficial insects, from ants. Yes, ants are beneficial insects. Other pollinators, hornets, wasps, all your friends, ladybugs, everybody that you want in your garden. This is like cracking it. And if you look closely in the big picture, this extra floral nectary is going to be located at the base of each leaf. So you might be wondering, like, well, why is this plant expending its energy to do this? You have plants that will put out their sugars in the flower because that's how they reproduce. It's crucially the reproduction. So I believe that the plant does this because it itself needs to attract these insects to keep disease away, to keep other pests away. And the extra carbohydrates are just a little reward. I kind of cheated. This wasn't just one plant. I chose an entire genus, Helianthus, sunflowers. So there's a good diversity of things to choose from. Starting from the left, we have Helianthus angustifolius, swamp sunflower. So if you say you have a wet area in your yard that you want to turn into beneficial insect habitat, put some swamp sunflower in there. The top right, Helianthus tuberosa, another great perennial. This is sunchoke. As you can see, they kind of have the tubers at the that grow in the soil that are loaded with, carbohydrates and nutrients for humans. So that would be a yield that you'd be getting out of it. And it's also a great, just beneficial pollinator attractor. Sunflowers also have extra floral nectaries kind of at the back of their flower. So they're great for that. They also kind of function as trap crops. A lot of times, if you get up close and personal with anybody in the Helianthus genus, you'll see a load of aphids on there, and normally the accompanying predators for the aphids. Down at the bottom right, you have the annual sunflower, Helianthus annuus. Great if you're kind of working in a crop rotation. Of course, they die back at the end of the year, but you get that massive biomass. Annual sunflower stems are great at the bottom of your compost pile. So kind of working into that concept of building soil fertility. This is a great genus for that. So I have Echinacea purpurea right here, purple coneflower. I just call it Echinacea. I'd say my favorite flower, just because it's so stunningly beautiful, a great beneficial insect attractor. So I just kind of wanted to take this time to explain the nativar versus straight species conflict even. So right down here at the bottom left, this is the cultivar that I showed you in that picture in my own garden. And I got that plant for free, so don't judge me. But it's not that big of a deal. The plant does provide nectar for pollinators. But a big reason why it's preferred to choose the straight species, one, because then that species will be more likely to reproduce and spread. Two, you're modifying the chemical makeup of the plant, so it might not provide as much nectar. Or say in the concept of, I want to select a plant that will be a larval host, that modification of the chemical makeup might affect larvae that are going to be kind of munching away at your flower or at your plant. And more often than not, you're just selecting this for aesthetic appeal. So if you can prioritize ecological function over aesthetic appeal, you should prioritize ecological function every time. All right, up next we have Pycnanthemum pilosum, hairy mountain mint. If you are on the west side beltline, you'll kind of see this all over the place. Another great member of the mint family that is wonderful for beneficial insect attraction. You can see honeybees just going crazy. These flowers in the springtime, early summer, just loaded with pollinators. The leaves itself are very, very aromatic, probably the most aromatic plant I have here on my list. A very, very strong mint flavor. I've also heard this plant being used in and around vegetables to deter deer, because if a deer gets one whiff of this, or especially one bite of it, apparently it's a flavor and a smell that deer do not prefer. I don't have any scientific evidence for this, but just common sense. And what to speak of, it's a beautiful plant to have in and around your garden. Passiflora incarnata again, passion flower. Once again, this isn't something that you should be planting right next to your tomato, but it's absolutely something that I would have in and around my garden, because like I said earlier, every time I've seen this flower, I've seen the Gulf fritillary larva on it at some point throughout the summer. And you do get a yield, one of just probably the most bedazzling, beautiful flower, I think, that is native to Georgia. As you can see, they call it a maypop, is another common name, because the flower just kind of pops for one day and then withers away. The passion fruit, out of it, I do want to give the disclaimer: if anyone has had fresh tropical passion fruit, don't expect that from the passion vine you're going to be growing in Georgia. I know that people will use the dried fruit in tea. That's probably the best way to use it. It's not really ripe to eat fresh unless it almost looks rotten. So just, I think that the best part of this plant is going to be the larval host function for it, and also the aesthetic appeal. The passion fruit is a little bonus. I know that there's also a lot of herbalist applications for the leaves themselves. Up next, we have Aesclepias tuberosa, butterfly weed. There are other great endemic species of Aesclepias to the Piedmont region, but I chose tuberosa. One, because it is the most spatially compatible. You can grow this in and around your vegetables in the same bed, and it's a great perennial to have that really functions as anchoring that soil structure. And also, it is just an excellent pollinator attractor, beneficial insect attractor, not only because it is the larval host of the monarch butterfly, as you can see on the right, but its flowers are just, when they're in full bloom, there's just a swarm of all kinds of bees, hoverflies, wasps, things you want around your garden. These flowers are excellent sources of nectar that are very available to all of those insects. Fun fact, a little anecdote. I was checking out my butterfly weed, and its seed pods, when they form kind of in the tail end of the summer, they're kind of like these green ovals. I noticed that there was probably the biggest praying mantis that I had ever seen that was just kind of posted up in there. And I saw like a butterfly that was cut in half right next to this massive praying mantis, who really camouflaged itself because the abdomen of the praying mantis looked exactly like the seed pod for a butterfly weed. So I'm sure that over time, these praying mantis kind of figured out, okay, this is where I'm going to hang out. My prey is going to come to me. I blend in. It kind of made me sad about the butterfly, but I'm all for attracting a praying mantis into my garden. Moving on, we have Achillea millefolium, Yarrow. Some people say Yarrow, tomato. This is a great plant. It has loads of herbalist uses, from tea to topical applications. It is very low growing, but once again, as I mentioned earlier, it has a very extensive root mass, which makes it an effective dynamic accumulator. Plant this around your fruit trees. You can plant this in and around your annual vegetables. I think they're great to have in a garden bed, in and around your annual vegetable production. And as it is in the carrot family, Apiaceae, you can see it has this umbel-shaped flower. Anything in that family is a great attractor for beneficial insects because it has a very shallow flowers that make the nectar very readily available to beneficial insects. We have Agastache foeniculum, Anise Hyssop, another mint family, functions very comparable to mountain mint, very aromatic, very spatially compatible, and just one of my favorites. It takes care of itself. It's a very tough plant. Delicious licorice flavor. I like to take off a sprig, put it in my water on a hot day. Very refreshing. Flowers are excellent attractors for beneficial insects, pollinators of all shapes and sizes. I've noticed that eastern tiger butterflies love these flowers, just for whatever reason. I almost always see them on mine and my garden. Monarda, another example of me kind of cheating. I did two species. So we have on the left, Monarda didyma, that's going to be scarlet bee balm. On the right, we have Monarda fasciculosa. Another common name for these plants is going to be wild bergamot, because if anyone is familiar with bergamot orange that is used in Earl Grey, these two species have a very similar aromatic quality to them. Very similar to Agastache, Anise Hyssop, and that in terms of application, I would make teas out of these. There's very great aromatic quality, wonderful pollinator attractors. Now, the difference between the two, other than the obvious color difference, Monarda didyma is not going to be quite as spatially compatible. I have found that Monarda vistuliosa is going to be a little shorter growing, not quite as aggressive. But one thing that I will warn, this plant is pretty susceptible to powdery mildew. I wouldn't have this one directly adjacent to your vegetables, but it's a great addition to your beneficial insect attractor strip. And very, very easy to grow, very easy to propagate through division, and just a wonderful addition to your garden. So I cheated earlier by having multiple species in one. I definitely am cheating now. I'm including an entire family. Grasses. Grasses are important, definitely important to have around your garden. Tall grasses specifically, because in the winter, the lush growth is very important habitat for overwintering insects. So I chose from left to right. I'm actually not going to try and pronounce these Latin names. Little blue stem over here on the left. If you are familiar with the west side beltline, we have all three of these grasses all over the place. Little blue stem, I would definitely put in the sunnier part of your yard, but it has a great visual appeal function, as well as providing that overwintering habitat. In the middle, we have Sorghastrum nutans, Indian grass. That's going to be a little taller, a little more aggressive growing, but also a little less picky than little blue stem. On the right, we have Muhlenbergia capillaris, pink muley grass. Probably the most visually appealing of all three, the most commonly used in landscaping of all three, and is known for its very stark pink autumnal blooms. And this is just my background as a West Side Beltline person. We do native prairie restoration, in which grasses are integral, and it's, I think, very important to develop the balance between the forest environment and the grassland environment to create sort of a savanna, because this is where we find the most biodiversity, in this edge environment between the two ecologies. All right. So where to find these plants? I'm going to have a shameless plug of the Trees Atlanta plant sale that we're kind of at the end of now, but I know there's going to be a second chance sale early in April. Other great environmentally minded nonprofits are going to be the Wild Center. They have a plant sale going on right now. And the Chattahoochee Nature Center is also another great nonprofit that I haven't attended their plant sale, but I've heard good things. All right. I'd just like to take this moment to thank everybody so much again, and this is going to be our segue into the Q&A function. All right, so Ashley, if you wanted to take over.
Sure, yeah. So we don't have any Q&As yet, but go ahead and put those in. Someone just posted in the chat and said there is a UGA native plant sale next week, so keep that in mind as well. But yeah, please go ahead and submit any questions that you have for Sam. While we're waiting, I'll ask one. Out of your top 10 that you were talking about like spatially, talking about spatial awareness, how much space, what would you pick? Like if you could pick one for like a small area, and then one if you could afford to have a much bigger area, which ones would you pick for either end of that spectrum?
For the small area, it's tough between Yarrow and the Agastache Anise Hyssop. Depending on how much time you have to take care of it, I think Yarrow is a little more self-reliant, but I'm going to say Yarrow. It's wonderful. It spreads, it takes care of itself. It's very tough. Really very readily accessible. I think it's probably a little easier to find than Anise Hyssop as well, but that just might be my subjective opinion. Now, for a big area, gotta think about this.
Obviously, if you had a bigger area, you could probably layer them and have a few different ones, but one that might not be so good for a small area, but would be good for a larger area.
The one that wouldn't be good for a small area right off the bat, I'm gonna say passion vine. That one, it's going to climb, it's going to spread. Once you get passion vine established, it will pop up all over the place, which is great. But if I had a big area, the one that I'd probably plant would be Monarda didima, the scarlet bee balm, just because that one also does spread to a lesser extent than the passion vine. Excuse me. But that isn't a plant that I would try and grow in a small, like say a pot. I wouldn't try that. But Yarrow and Anise Hyssop, I think I've seen grow in pots. I've also seen the butterfly weed, Aesclepias tuberosa. I've seen that grown in pots successfully.
Okay.
But yeah, if anyone else has any questions, I see one on the Q&A.
Yeah, someone had a question on the Q&A that was kind of similar to what I asked, but they
Cool.
said, I know you already showed your top 10, but could you give their mature size so we know what to
Of
expect?
course. I should have explained that. I can kind of work backwards. So little blue stem on the left, that is going to get about 3 feet tall. Sorghastrum nutans, Indian grass, that'll get about as tall as me. So that's about 5 to 6 feet tall. That is going to be the biggest grass in here. Muhlenbergia capillaris, pink muhly grass, that's probably going to be the smallest of all of them. That's going to get about 2 to 3 feet tall. It's going to be a little wider than the other ones. Monarda, so let me go over Monarda didyma. That one will get about 3, maybe 4 feet tall, but it will spread outwards. A mature plant would probably spread outwards about as tall as it is, like 4 feet, and it'll spread as well. Monarda fistulosa, that'll only get probably about 2, 3 feet tall. I mean, of course, depending on how sunny the environment is, generally plants are going to be reaching for the sun a little more if it's in a shady environment. But if it's sunny, it might grow a little more flush outside. Agastache foeniculum, Anise Hyssop will only get about 3 to 4 feet tall as well. Yarrow is only going to be knee height, I think, maybe 2 feet tall. Probably the most spatially compatible plant I have on here, Yarrow, which is why I chose it for your question. My mistake. I should have listed this under information. Aesclepias tuberosa will be comparable size to Yarrow. I think it's going to be a little bigger. It's going to be slightly taller and doesn't spread quite as much as Yarrow. Yarrow, for what it lacks in height, it spreads out. Passion flower, I mean, it's a vine, so it's only going to get as tall as the trellis or whatever plant it's growing on. But once it's mature, it can really kind of take over. So it's a plant that I love, but it's something that don't plant it next to something that is very delicate, is all I will say. Pycnanthemum pilosum, that'll only get about comparable size as the Monarda, about 3, maybe 4 feet tall. And in terms of width, about comparable to Monarda, maybe 3 feet wide if it's very mature, 3-4 feet wide. Echinacea is going to be very, very small. 3 feet tall. 3 feet tall is the biggest I've seen, honestly. But they don't really spread too much. So I wouldn't say they're going to get more than about 4 feet, 3 feet wide. But this is another good option to have in a container. I've seen these grown in containers very well as well. Now your sunflowers, these are the big boys. These they're not that spatially compatible, but just what to speak of how good they are as habitat. I think that Helianthus angustifolis is going to be the smallest of all of them. Bottom left, that's going to be the swamp sunflower. That's going to be the smallest. I've seen that maybe about 4 or 5 feet. Now, sunchokes and the annual sunflower, these can get massive. These can get 9 feet tall. I've seen. It really does depend on the situation, but these are species that I would plant. These are backyard plants. You know, they look beautiful when they're in the bloom, but they do flop over, especially these 2 species on the right. Yeah, these are probably going to be the least spatially compatible plant of all of them, probably even more so than the passion flower. Partridge pea. So this plant, it gets about 4 to 5 feet tall. I've seen it's pretty big, and it does spread. It spreads out pretty effectively. So this almost functions well in a hedge almost. I've seen it used well on slopes, but not the most spatially compatible. A great plant to have in and around, say, a fruit tree. 1, for the nitrogen fixation, but 2, just with its spreading function, it works really well as a ground cover. I think that was it. I should have thought to include some data written down. All right, now was there another question?
There's some in the chat that I want to go ahead and address first, and then we'll jump back to this Q&A. So someone asked 2 different questions. I'll give them both to you and you can answer them one at a time. So they said, honeysuckle is taking over. What do you do about that? And then the other one is, are there any mosquito repellent plants?
So I'm going to start with a mosquito repellent plant. I did focus primarily on the herbaceous plants. If I did a top 10 of like say shrubs or trees, American beautyberry, that was a Calicarpa americana. I have heard about the insect repellent qualities of its essential oil. If you ever kind of like plucked off some beautyberry leaves and smelt it, it kind of has not quite like a lemongrass smell, but it's just a very like stark scent that I've read that it repels mosquitoes. I haven't really read any like scientific studies to know for certain if that's proved, but I know that that is something good to have around. And the first question, I'm sorry, could you remind me again?
It was the honeysuckle. Oh,
Honeysuckle.
yes, they're
So,
trying to smother it. The honeysuckle. She just added that in.
Mother, that is tough. I am a firm believer that pulling, I mean, if you're going to be pulling the honeysuckle, which is probably, I mean, I hate to say that, that's the most effective way to get it. You pull it out. And I'm a firm believer that if I'm going to be pulling something up, I want to plant something in its place. Because if you leave that soil bare, there's just a good chance that something else is going to come right behind it. Now, if it's honeysuckle, then I'm assuming it's probably going to be in a forest edge environment. Now, here's another place where I would definitely plug beautyberry again, because it functions well in that similar environment. This is where I would say you're going to be pulling it if it's honeysuckle, but I would definitely look into replacing what you pulled up with a native plant. Evergreen, I would probably find an evergreen shrub. I don't know, Florida anise is probably a good example. Putting a tree there, putting anything in any way, shape, or form in what you pulled is probably your best bet. But I wish I had a better answer for you than how to get rid of it. My answer is pull it. But once again, I would definitely show up to our native plant sale and then find something that your specific environment that is overrun by honeysuckle. I would find out something that would work there.
Okay, awesome. So there's one more question that I'm seeing. If you guys have any more, go ahead and submit them. So this person, and I'm sorry, I don't know, the Xers, are you looking at that? Urses Society lists partridge pea as a possible cover crop for farms. Have you seen it used in a farm landscape? And if not, do you agree it might be a good candidate for a native cover crop?
So I 100% think it should be utilized in and around agriculture for the reasons I explained earlier. When I think of a cover crop, I usually am thinking of an annual. Partridge pea is, it lives a few years and it kind of has a deep root growth. When I think of a cover crop, I'm thinking of something that will grow rapidly, die off to build soil structure, to cover the soil, to kind of maximize photosynthesis in the soil that you're going to be growing in. But I wouldn't particularly use a perennial for that. I'm going to plug a non-native species. I'm so sorry. Crimson clover is going to be my favorite cover crop for the cool season. That's going to be a nitrogen fixer just like partridge pea. Great biomass production in the cool season. It's great habitat for beneficial insects. If you ever check out a lush growth of crimson clover in the wintertime, you kind of peel back the leaves, you see like all kinds of spider action going on in there. It's really cool. And of course, if anybody's familiar with crimson clover blooming in the springtime, just these gorgeous crimson blooms that are irresistible to pollinators of any kind. I would definitely use partridge pea as a ground cover, not necessarily a cover crop, but a ground cover in a agroforestry setting. Say if you had, some spaced out fruit trees, I would absolutely put partridge pea in between them. Because one, it can kind of handle being chopped and dropped a lot, which will help build a biomass and then release more and more nitrogen into the soil. But when I think of cover crop, once again, I'm thinking of an annual. When I'm thinking of ground cover, I'm thinking of a perennial. And I hope that helps.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you. I'm not seeing any more questions. I'm looking in the
I'm
chat as well.
definitely, I'm good to hang out a little more if anybody has anything. Once again, I'd just like to take this moment to thank everybody for showing up. It really means a lot to me to have this opportunity. And I love sharing what I've learned about this on the subject.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. Your knowledge is very we can definitely tell you have a lot of knowledge with your presentation and all your
And
all these different plants. So thank you for sharing
thank
that
you.
with all of us.
Once again, like I have no academic background on this. I studied history in college. Everything that I've learned, I've either learned just on the job or the internet. It's readily available to anybody. But I will definitely say that if you want to learn, just like learning experience is important. You know, get involved in your nearest community garden, wild center, trees Atlanta, Chattahoochee Nature Reserve. Get involved with these nonprofits. Great resources, great people to talk to.
Mhm.
But you don't need an academic background for this. Definitely helps because a lot of my coworkers will, kind of, they're the reason why I know a lot of what I know. Is I have many coworkers that have shared their knowledge with me.
Mhm. That's awesome. All right. Well, thank you guys for joining us. Like I said, I will be emailing out a link so you can go back and reference any part of this presentation that you'd like. And we hope to see you on some future workshops that we hold. So
All right. Thank you all so much.
I'm going to go ahead and end it. Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Bye.